Hoping not to say too much, because I don't know at all. Yeah. Are they a language class? Mm-hmm. Oh, great. Thank you for coming. And if your teacher made you tell your teacher. Okay.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone here and online to our next lecture, which is today, presented by Dr. Jeffrey Brooks. My name is Chuck Smythe. I'm the senior ethnologist here at Sealaska Heritage Institute, and Dr. Brooks is going to speak about indigenous knowledge and species assessment for the Alexander Archipelago Wolf, successes, challenges, and lesson learned. He'll explain that that was a research project he did with others, looking at the Alexander Archipelago wolf here in southeast Alaska. Dr. Brooks is a social scientist with the U.S. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. In 2006, Jeff earned a MS in Conservation Ecology and Sustainable Development and a Ph.D. in Natural Resource Recreation and Tourism later. That was after that. He completed postdoc research as a social science analyst with the USDA Forest Service in Colorado. Since then, he has worked in Alaska as a social scientist for the National Wildlife Refuge System, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Office of Subsistence Management, and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Office of Environment. His interests include applying social science research to collaborative resources management, environmental impact assessment, tribal engagement, and public involvement. I encourage everyone to turn off their phone. And also, we will have questions at the end of the talk, both live here and online. You can submit, online viewers can submit their questions via the chat on YouTube. Okay, Dr. Brooks, thank you. Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Smythe. That was a nice introduction. I appreciate it very much. I would like to start by saying it's a great honor for me to be here today. I'd like to thank Sealaska Heritage for inviting me. I have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to read from a script a lot of times. Can you hear me, sir? It's too far. How about that? That better? All right, thank you. So I timed this talk. It's not the full hour, so there should be time for questions, but I'm going to get right into it. So, good afternoon, folks. Thank you for being here with us today in Acknowledgements. I would like to thank the clans and federally recognized tribes of this territory for their care and respect of the land. I would also like to thank Sealaska Heritage Institute for inviting me to speak. You have greatly honored me. As Mr. Smythe said, my name is Jeff Brooks. You don't have to call me Dr. Brooks, just Jeff. My parents are James and Carol Brooks from Tawas, Michigan, on the shores of Lake Huron. My ancestors are from Finland, Ireland, Germany, and Canada. I work for the United States Department of Interior, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in Anchorage as a social scientist, and now as an environmental protection specialist. I just changed jobs a couple weeks ago. I have served as a federal civil servant for 21 years, 16 of those in Alaska. I currently live in Anchorage with my wife and children on the Dena'ina homeland. I thank all Alaska Native peoples for their continued land stewardship. Sealaska Heritage Institute invited me here today to share information about the wolf study I worked on with them and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. Members of the research team are listed in this opening slide. Right about the time the pandemic was upon us, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service received a petition to list the coastal wolves for protections under the Endangered Species Act. This subspecies of gray wolf is also called the Alexander Archipelago wolf. The service, Fish and Wildlife Service that is, had about 1 year from the time of the petition to complete a species status assessment to comply with the Endangered Species Act. So this talk is about an endangered species regulatory action that the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service had to do. The indigenous peoples of Southeast Alaska have been living with and engaging with wolf for thousands of years. Everyone involved knew that 1 year for this important work was not enough time, but we rolled up our sleeves and got to work regardless of the regulatory time frame. I'm going to be sharing the voice of a lot of your people in the region, so bear with me. This is really my favorite part of this study, is actually listening to what the experts on the ground have had to say. So let's begin by listening to the voice from the land. This was one of the people that was interviewed and helped co-author the study, Mr. Michael Jackson from Cake. Our knowledge is ancient and continuous. Wolves are cherished just like a person. Our relations with wolves are local and intimate. Acknowledgement and respect of our knowledge is a key part of the regulatory process. The incorporation of our knowledge in the determination is a significant step. A concern of ours is that the law separates and alienates us from our surroundings and our relationships with all of our natural resources, which include wolves. So I've just read to you the words of Mr. Michael Jackson from Cake. He spoke these in an interview to Dr. Steve Langdon, who was here 2 days ago talking about this very study. During this presentation, I will share the voices of other Indigenous experts who partnered with us on the study. So, what have we learned thus far? Well, there seems to be some friction or disconnect between the laws and the regulations and the local sentiment on the land where the wolves and the people are living, both in terms of timelines and alienation caused by regulations and laws. The reason for this lecture is to share a project with the people of the region where it occurred. It's important to bring back the studies to the places where they occurred. And it is still occurring, by the way, from the indigenous perspective. Wolves and people are still out there on the land. The talk follows a free and open access publication, which you can find at that URL on this slide. I'm going to hold it up right here if you would like to look at it after the talk. So the study was a study of indigenous knowledge, also called, some people call it traditional ecological knowledge, about coastal wolves, sponsored by the Fish and Wildlife Service and administered by Sealaska Heritage Institute and its consultants in 2022 and 2023. To implement this study, the agency funded a cooperative agreement with SHI, and the TEK, or Indigenous Knowledge Study, was funded to formally inform the legal document I talked about called the Species Status Assessment. I also call that the SSA. Now, this is something that has to happen under the Endangered Species Act. So they prepared the SSA to help the decision makers make a determination on whether or not the wolf needs to be protected at this time. And the indigenous knowledge that we collected was used to inform that report. So I served as a co-principal investigator on the study, working closely with Dr. Langdon and regional wolf experts who you saw on the opening slide, SHI and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I will tell you that I learned a great deal from the indigenous knowledge experts with whom we partnered. These partners are co-authors on the publication that I held up as well. I will share what we did, what we learned, what it means, and what to do about it now and in the future. I will discuss successes, challenges, and lessons learned from the study and how the Fish and Wildlife Service applied indigenous knowledge to its decision under the Endangered Species Act. So what was our approach? The planning was very expedited because, if you remember, we had about 1 year to get it done. The tribal consultations were too few due to the short regulatory timeline, but there was no time to worry about that. We focused on the positives and got to work. On March 2nd, 2022, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service held a government-to-government consultation with the Craig Tribal Association and the organized villages of Cake and Kasan. The tribal leaders thanked the Fish and Wildlife Service for talking with them. They stressed the need for more time and more tribal consultations. They also focused on a need to provide adequate subsistence harvest of deer and moose for communities in the region. They described how unbalanced predation by wolves and historic cutting of old growth were leading to far too few deer. They described a need for agency managers to obtain better wolf population estimates, to set proper quotas for subsistence wolf harvest. The tribal leaders were in agreement that wolves in Southeast Alaska are healthy and abundant and not endangered. They were also concerned that listing the wolf for protections under the Endangered Species Act would result in suffering of the local people who rely on deer and moose. They expressed frustration over outsiders trying to make decisions on their homelands. Listen to Mr. Michael DeVille. Outsiders do not know what is going on in our place. They are trying to make local decisions, and that is not right. Wolves adversely affect deer harvest. Deer are in decline in past years, and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game reports will indicate that. The geography we have will support a lot of deer, but we need to keep predators in check. It is very devastating to deer. It's from high predation. You also need to stop harvest of old-growth forests to have a place for deer to overwinter. One more tribal leader at this consultation told the Fish and Wildlife Service, "Thank you for including tribal leaders, because nobody usually comes to us to ask us about what we know about our areas. We do see healthy wolf populations on the ground. We hear them. I've seen the cycle of these wolves over 65 years, and I believe they have the right to live. But we know for a fact that they are healthy around us. Thank you for including us tribal leaders. We do have local knowledge, and it's time the agency starts listening to us. This has been on my mind for a long time, and I'm trying to be respectful. I just want to share my experience." So shortly after this tribal consultation, the Fish and Wildlife Service met with Sealaska Heritage Institute and the consultants, Brooks and Dr. Langdon, that's me, to discuss gaps in the agency's knowledge about coastal wolves. So they identified gaps that included movements of wolves, habitat use, population dynamics of wolves and their prey, i.e. the deer and moose, other things, human effects on wolves and their prey, and gaps in geographic coverage of their existing data. The project area is the range of the coastal wolves in Southeast Alaska. Canada was not part of the TEK study that we did. The dark line on this map shows you the range of the wolves we studied. 9 Indigenous knowledge experts partnered for the initial part of the study. Local experts were contacted who were highly knowledgeable about wolves based on their years of experience trapping and hunting wolves, or because they knew about the position and significance of wolf in Tlingit society and culture. Initial contacts referred the team to other experts with whom to speak. With help from contacts in the region, we located experts who could speak about places in the wolf's range from north to south. We interviewed 2 for the Yakutat area, 1 for Excursion Inlet, 2 for Cake, 3 for Klawak and Craig, and 1 for the Heidelberg area. We focused the analysis of these interviews on specific places in the areas described by each expert, because the Indigenous knowledge is closely tied to specific ecosystems, relationships, and places in the landscape where Indigenous experts have lived and gained extensive experience with wolves by being on the land and engaging with their cultures. So initially, Steve Langdon collected 9 interviews from 10 people ages 25 to 77 in the spring of 2022. 7 of the Indigenous partners had trapped wolves during their lives, and 5 of those trappers had hunted wolves. All have long family histories in Southeast Alaska. They are co-authors of the publications because the study would not have been possible without their experiences and intellectual contributions. Later that fall, Dr. Langdon returned to the region to interview 6 additional wolf experts to represent the range of the wolf more completely. These 6 are in the final report, but not in the initial interim report used by the agency to inform the species status assessment. And my talk today will primarily focus on the original 9 interviews. So we made 9 audio recordings of those interviews. They were transcribed verbatim, typed out, resulting in 10 hours of conversation about wolf. Each Indigenous expert was given an informed consent form to read and sign beforehand, and they were compensated with an honorarium. All agreed to be identified by name in the study. The partners were given an opportunity to review their transcripts, the species status assessment report, and the Indigenous knowledge reports. To meet the 12-month expedited timeline, we applied what's called rapid appraisal, some qualitative interviewing, and grounded theory analysis. Rapid appraisal is a technique used to expeditiously develop an initial and preliminary and often qualitative understanding of a situation, such as Indigenous peoples' knowledge of wolves and how it may contribute to factual information for a species status assessment. The semi-directed interviewing that we did works well for documenting Indigenous knowledge because it is very flexible, allowing for questions to be directed to topics of interest, like the gaps the agency identified in their knowledge, while also capturing important contextual knowledge not directly targeted. It creates opportunities for dialogue or texts that contain Indigenous knowledge and reflect the Indigenous traditions of oral history, storytelling, and transmission of knowledge through the spoken word. Grounded theory is an approach to social science analysis that is used to uncover concepts and categories, not to test hypotheses or to replicate theory. We used it to describe and organize the interviews, to find patterns in that data, and to understand meanings of the current situation. Dr. Langdon encouraged open-ended conversations to share experiences about wolves on the land and to learn about wolf biology and wolf ecology, including hunting behaviors and prey, characteristics and movements, and interactions with humans. These were identified to address gaps in Western knowledge that were identified in the planning phase by the agency. Dr. Langdon also asked about sociocultural connections to wolves and how wolf is used and displayed in names, clan crests, ceremonies, sacred atau, and kuik. Some of the local experts shared both cultural and ecological information, and others shared one type or the other. We studied the interviews to identify Indigenous knowledge that addressed the gaps that the Fish and Wildlife Service identified, and also to learn about relationships between the people of these places and wolf. We carefully listened to these recordings at least 2 or 3 times to identify Indigenous knowledge. We also read through the typed up transcripts. There's a comment function in MS Word that you can use to apply coding labels to selected sections of interviews. And these labels were very short descriptions and phrases that summarized selected text and reflected gaps in the agency's knowledge. Many of the labels corresponded to the interview questions we asked because those questions were designed to learn about wolves and other items that the agency did not already have. So a couple examples of these labels that we put on the transcripts. One was called 2 types of wolves. This was used to indicate knowledge about the occurrence, differences, and interactions between coastal wolves and larger interior wolves. Another one we used was wolf health. This was used to identify Indigenous observations of body condition or malady. Say that the skin or the hair was falling out. Wolf hunting behaviors, diet, and movement patterns was another code that was used to identify predatory and travel behaviors by wolves. We also learned about how many wolves are on the land and where they live. Some of our partners provided extensive geographic information about wolf distribution, range, and locations, sizes, and names of specific packs. We mapped these locations with their assistance when adequate geographical and place name data were shared. We also tabulated this information into a table for the final report to provide estimates of wolf abundance and also were used in the species status assessment. So interestingly enough, the information for the Prince of Wales Island area about pack sizes and number of packs was used as a quantitative model of population estimate by the agency in the species status assessment. Moving along. The Indigenous research partners explained the importance and position of wolf in Tlingit culture and substantial information about wolf behaviors, traits, and habits. The wolf experts addressed gaps in Western knowledge, and they generated narratives about their experiences with wolf. Some of the people we talked with reported over 50 years of active cultural engagement on the land with wolves. Next, I will share findings and insights about the cultural significance of wolf, which, by the way, is my favorite part. The Tlingit concept of time in relation to ancestors and ceremony, the Tlingit concept of balance in land stewardship, and where and how TEK, or Indigenous knowledge, was applied in the species status assessment. I'll also show you some successes, challenges, and lessons learned. To properly go over the cultural importance of the species, I'm going to read to you some words from the people we interviewed. This was largely based on what we learned from the interviewees. So what I did was I summarized the findings into a diagram that showed here in these three overlapping circles. It basically is a merger of natural, sacred, and cultural aspects of how people exist with wolves on the land and in society. Now I'm going to share those local voices that I talked about. Regarding wolves, Mr. Devlin Anderstrom from Yakutat shared, we have a lot of respect for wolves because we think about them as another type of people. I was just having this conversation with somebody the other day about what the difference is between a real Tlingit worldview and the modern worldview. And one of the things is that in school, we go there and we learn that humans are animals. We're part of the animal kingdom. And for us, when we talk about things in Tlingit, like every type of species, we call it the people. So the wolf species, that's Gooch Kwane, the wolf people. So to us, it's the other way around. We see everything else as being people too, especially the wolves because they're so similar to us. The wolf people have this symbiotic relationship with ravens like we do. I think that's actually where that moiety comes from. Mr. Duville from Craig stated, I don't have any hatred for wolves. They're really probably the best at what they do. I mean, they're really good at it. I think that the hate comes from competing for food, tempts the wolf, and they're so much better at hunting than any human. They are absolutely the peak deer predator, so they can get deer where you can't, and it frustrates a lot of people. They have a good nose, they have good ears, they can move fast. If they get after a deer, it doesn't stand a chance. They will get it. You can hunt in a place where you can hardly even get a deer, and wolf will be fat, seriously fat as deer. Mr. Michael Jackson added, they didn't just go out to kill wolf. If they saw a wolf, they just didn't kill it. He's talking about his elders, his uncles probably, those that raised him, maybe the ancestors too. They had to get ready. They had to go do a ritual. And when they killed it, there was a ritual to put it to rest. It wasn't just, I'm going out to get wolves and say, ha, I'm a big sports hunter, and put it on the wall. No. Even today, when my son goes hunting, I told him right from the beginning, and he was wondering why I put water in the mouth or go down and drink water out of the stream and come back and share it with deer or wolf. Mink, otter, same as seal. You can put salt water in your mouth and not swallow it and go over and share it with the animals for its last drink. That's part of the ritual, laying to rest and closing the eyes. Now we hear from Delvin once more. Devlin is his name. I talk to them when we're out on the land. My grandmother taught me that the animals will hear you and understand you if you talk to them and explain what you're doing there. So I'll talk to the wolves and the bears and explain to them what I'm doing out there. I'll ask them not to let any harm come to me, and even to protect me, because that pack out there, those are the same wolves that protected my Drumhouse clan ancestor when he got hurt. So they're kind of like relatives. That's the way we see them. Miss Judith Ramos also spoke. Most of the stories that I've learned about were through my mother. She would accompany her father Olaf, and whenever they would encounter a wolf, they would talk to Wolf. Because his people, the Twikweti clan, have a relationship with Wolf. I grew up hearing stories about the wolf. They would come down mostly in the winter from the mountains down to the Yakutat area near town. We would just talk to them like they were his brothers, greet them, and my mom would talk to them. She would tell stories about talking to wolves. When they would accompany her and her father as they were doing things out on the land, she would talk about how the wolf would just be there. She had a real love for the wolves, and I think there was a sense the wolf had a kind of relationship with them through Olaf's family. They were like brothers. Mr. Rowan continued, well, like when our Atu come out, we believe that's all our ancestors being represented. They're with us. That's our uncles. They're standing with us when they're brought out. They're with us. It's like, say you went to Ireland and you guys had a special ceremony that said your ancestors are here now. How would you feel? I would feel pretty darn good that they're here with me, and that's represented in these sacred items. That's the kind of power that we're talking about. It's like we're with our ancestors because they did the same things. Where we practice it is almost darn near within a quarter mile of where they practice it. You know, living it on the land. Mr. Jackson continued, the people noticed the impact of wolf because the wolves would eat the deer and the deer would get scared and scarce. They knew it because there were some villages that didn't trap wolves. They didn't have trappers who went out of their way to go and get wolves, and here they had been almost starving. I remember my father telling me about those different places he'd go where that was happening. When he'd tell those stories, the meaning of the story was that you had to control wolves. Mr. Scott Jackson said, that's the bottom line. We're subsistence trappers, not trying to overstep our boundaries and trying to show respect. We're trying to respectfully get something back that pays dividends into our family. This is how a lot of us are rich. If we can keep our subsistence rich, our community remains rich. And it keeps us from having to go to the store so often. I keep reiterating why I do this. We're trying to enhance our subsistence way of life. There's such a separation of opinion on what's the best way to go about managing. And I think the right way to manage them is to allow subsistence trappers to keep trapping because they're not out there to decimate the wolves. We're out there to help increase the subsistence way of life. We're just not all killers who are up to no good. I respect everything, and out of respect, you need a balance. So what I've learned from listening to these experts here in the region is that the Tlingit people in Southeast Alaska relate to wolves by living very closely with them in their homelands, practicing their culture through ceremony and ritual, reaffirming their indigenous identity, and continuing to practice their way of life on the land and the sea. Stories and experience of Tlingit-Wolf relations are passed down through the generations. Wolf is part of Tlingit existence, and it merges time, ecology, place, and respect. In a nutshell, they share a very simple equation or formula with us. Respect plus control equals balance. Now, let's very briefly break to hear another local voice. Wolf has to eat, and we have to eat, said Mr. Thomas George. That was about the simplest statement that we heard, and very, very powerful, in my opinion. Okay, now how did this information inform the document that was needed for the legal regulatory decision? Well, the first step in applying indigenous knowledge, the things that you've heard about, was for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service team to review the TEK report that we submitted in summer of 2022. They had to identify relevant knowledge to include in the species status assessment. All the TEK added to the body of that assessment was cited in standard scientific format, and the entire Indigenous knowledge report was included as an appendix to the SSA in the back. The introduction of that SSA provided a summary of the TEK study, design, and a brief description of the Indigenous way of knowing. The table in this slide summarizes where the Indigenous knowledge informed the species status assessment report. If you look in the first column, you'll see some of the topics that were covered in the agency report. And if you look in the next column, you'll see the Indigenous knowledge that met those areas. One of the things that they talked about quite a bit in the north and other parts was the comparison of two types of wolves. That being the smaller coastal wolves and the larger interior wolves. They also shared a lot of information about wolf reproduction, dispersal, wolf social organization, diet and prey, how wolf territories are organized, and the effects of historic logging and the numbers and sizes of wolf packs. So you see, this is an example of the ecological or biological knowledge that we learned, whereas the quotes that I shared with you before are an example of the cultural significance of the species. This is where I brief you on some successes, challenges, and lessons learned. The next two tables summarize what worked, or our successes, what didn't work, and the lessons that we learned during different stages of the project. So let's take a couple examples. If you look at this first slide, if you see the first column, project stage, if we start with the selection of the research partners, what we learned is that we were able to find highly knowledgeable and experienced local men and one woman that knew a great deal about wolves. They also had the time and the willingness to sit down and talk to us for almost an hour in some cases. One of our challenges in this respect was we didn't properly represent Haida and Tsimshian. We mainly talked to Tlingit hunters and experts. But later in the final report, we represented the other areas better. What did we really learn? Well, we learned that you need to talk to both wolf trappers and hunters. You need to talk to both cultural experts and ecological experts. And you need to allow enough time to find people that represent the entire range of the wolf. So let's move down to the last row, reviews and follow-up. What is really interesting about this is the Fish and Wildlife Service is using this study as a showcase of a success story. So there's been some training broadcasts produced from the study for Fish and Wildlife Service employees. So this is possibly going to be used again in other species status assessments for other endangered species throughout the country. A challenge, there was not enough time for proper review and follow-up and back and forth with the local experts. And as far as document review goes, one of our lessons learned was definitely do not expect people to review reports and give you feedback during fishing season. Because of the timing of the endangered species process, the review of one of the reports occurred during the start of salmon season. So that's a big problem, obviously. Another thing that we learned was that really with rural experts, when you're working with rural people, giving them a document to read and asking for written format is probably not the best approach. We need to come up with other approaches that fit better. So maybe a workshop or a focus group where we can sit down and talk one-on-one or with small groups about, okay, this is what we found, how does it match with what you wanted us to say? We also looked at these challenges and successes in the species status assessment and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service internal mindset and overall. So overall, I would say that the agency learned a great deal about wolves and the relationships that people have in Southeast with them. It has improved their awareness of the scope and value of Indigenous knowledge. And they've started to build a foundation, with a little bit of trust, some relationships. Hopefully that will be improved so that when they come back for more interactions with the people here, that they'll have a good footing. One of the challenges overall, again, we had to do a reactive approach instead of being proactive because we didn't have enough time. So we also learned that we need to budget more time and resources for this type of work, that the agency needs to co-create the methods and the approach to these studies beforehand. And one of the most important things we learned is that the reason people harvest wolves in this region is to protect their subsistence way of life forever, in perpetuity. All right, now we also made some recommendations based on these findings. These include the need for the agencies to build more and better capacity, trust, and relationships, the need for a co-produced approach to research regarding wolves, and we also learned that we need to include more about people and culture in the Endangered Species Act process. I'm going to touch on that one as a highlight. So that recommendation, which was to better include people in the species status assessment approach for the endangered species decision-making, is very important. While I was preparing for this lecture, I did a real quick word search on the language of the Endangered Species Act. And I searched on these terms that you see in the table. So when it comes to the human dimensions or the sociocultural dimensions of wildlife, the Endangered Species Act is rather thin. You can see culture, identity, social, and society don't appear at all in the language of the law. People appeared once. Traditional, in the sense of native handicrafts and clothing and artwork, appeared twice in Section 10. The word human appeared 4 times in 2 sections. Alaska Native appeared 5 times in 2 sections. Economics appeared 8 times in 2 sections, mainly to protect business interests. Subsistence appeared 10 times in Section 10. So Section 10 of the Act allows for exceptions on subsistence take of protected species, which is highly appropriate in Alaska due to the subsistence priority here. Now, finally, a couple of days later, after thinking about this, I said, why don't I search on the word species? I keep going around telling everybody it's a species-centric act. So I searched on the word species. It came up 372 times, in every exception except 2. That's what I mean when I say the act is species-centric. And, you know, that's to be expected. It's about species protection. However, if you remember Michael Jackson's words, the law alienates us from our resources. This is an example. All right, how do we account for people? Under the Endangered Species Act, as I've said, federal agencies are not necessarily authorized to consider social and cultural issues when making a determination. The agencies are really only directed to consider the status of a species itself. So the problem is the Alexander Archipelago wolf exists in an environment that is shaped by human beings and does not exist independently of the effects of human beings. Therefore, the status of the subspecies is closely intertwined with the status and viability of human communities, and the federal agencies should account for that in their wildlife assessment work. So upon comparing these 2 models in the slide, a logical first step would be for the 2 partners, the agency and the Indigenous experts, to begin talking about how to co-develop a framework that includes the Tlingit model. Both frameworks include components and parameters related to wolves, ungulates, which are deer and moose, and humans. The agency focuses on wolves and their long-term viability, while Tlingit focus on the long-term viability of all 3 as interdependent beings living in a social and ecological system. So it's reasonable to say there are key commonalities between the 2 frameworks in terms of ecosystem health, sustainability, and long-term viability. In cases where endangered or predators are petitioned to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, if they coexist with human populations, in those cases, we recommend that the agency work with its partners to share focus and co-produce a species status assessment, a tool for the Endangered Species Act work that frames species viability within its larger context. And what I mean by that is the larger social and cultural context. The study overall, the project I should say, has been quite productive with archived interview data and audio recordings. Those are housed here at Sealaska Heritage Institute. There are several documents and presentations and lectures like this one. I brought 3 examples here today if you would like to look at those after the talk. I do need to take them back with me, however, because they're the only ones I brought. I can share the journal article, though, because well, that's online, free access for everybody. Now, it's time for me to close up, but I want to acknowledge the team first. You see in this list, I like to thank everybody listed here and all those that I may have forgot to list. This project wouldn't have been possible without their help and their hard efforts. In the words of Sisuk Leonetti, we had the dream team. Sisuk works for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And speaking of teams, please admire this historic photo of members of the Kagwantan clan taken in 1904. That looks like the team that could get things done. I really am impressed by that photo. It's a long time ago, too. If you remember the opening slide that had that house post is the same one, and it also appears in this close. So, Colonel Shis, thank you very much. You may ask any questions right now or make comments. You can also contact me later at that address and phone number. I brought business cards. I have an open door policy. I'd love to talk to you anytime about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That was great.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, sir.
Goodness, Chisha, for recognizing the Kagwantan. Very good introduction. Just a little bit of history. I'm a ETK, the Eagle Nest Kagwantan, a spokesman for them. And so I greatly appreciate your time. I'm also part of the CRAC, Southeast Regional, and I represent Juneau of Alaska. And I know Mr. DeVille very well. He's part of the team. And make note, there's 13 of us, and almost 3/4 of us are Alaska Native people from all the villages. So just to share a piece of the wolf and the history of, you see the wolf that's up on there, the history of it's almost 10 to thousands of years old when we represented the wolf and used it respectfully. And when one of our uncles was out on a hunting trip and ran into a wolf, and as he was walking out in the field, the wolf was coming closer and closer, and he had a bone in his jaw. And he said, "Don't hurt me, I'm gonna help you." So he helped the wolf and got the bone out. His ribs were showing, he wasn't doing well. And then the wolf just ran off. But then it was late, so he fell asleep by the tree. And while he was sleeping by the tree, he had a vision that came back where the same incident happened, where the wolf came running at him, but he was defending himself and getting position, but the wolf stood up as a human and said, "Hey, thank you. I really appreciate you helping me." I said, and then the man asked him to teach him, the wolf, to teach him about being a good hunter. And he talked about the wind and the direction it needed to be while you were hunting. But you heard the deer. That was one of the things that they hunted, was the deer. They were able to make that noise, just like the bear hoots. It made the same sound. I really encourage you to get a hold of Deanna Perry, the Southeast Regional, because every time we have a meeting, there's hundreds and hundreds of people that come to sit at the table. Yeah.
This is a question period.
Yeah, he asked me, he said comment. Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's okay. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, sir.
There's a lot more information I could give you too. I'd like to talk to you later.
Okay, we can.
The information that can help you. And there's lots of documents of that right now.
Do we have any more questions
Okay, thank
in
you,
the
sir.
audience?
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm just curious if there's any cross-border collaboration with Canada, because wildlife is wildlife and it doesn't respect borders, right? So being able to get some information from their side, have you ever worked with any government entities over there?
No, personally, I have not. Thank you for that question. The species status assessment was focused on Southeast Alaska, mainly because there was a U.S. A law that was being petitioned for protections. I think our scientists here, our biologists, work with the Canadians on a lot of ecological and biological issues. And some of those were probably talked about in their assessment. But this study of the Southeast Indigenous peoples' knowledge and cultural significance of wolf only talked to folks in Southeast Alaska. But as you correctly said, the wildlife and the people cross the border. That's just an arbitrary border that was imposed by politicians, so to speak. And we learned that territories of folks here go into Canada. We learned that wolves go into Canada and come from Canada. It's a very good point you make, and I'm pretty sure the biologists work together internationally. But in this study of indigenous knowledge, we focused on the Alaska side. Thank you. Yes, Kelly.
So I'm going to give you the same question I gave Steve Langdon, which is, if you had more money and time, what would you do? And also, if there were are there any other species that you think you should be doing a similar study with?
Well, thank you, Kelly. I remember that question from 2 days ago. It was a very good one. Well, I think in this case, money and time were limited. Sealaska Heritage did have to chip in extra money so that we could do 6 more interviews and some other work. But if we had more time and funds, I think we would have spent 2 to 5 years with the people on the ground doing the work and the interviewing and the participant observation instead of the 6 to 9 months that we had. So, for example, we probably would have produced more maps of packs. We probably would have gone out on the land with hunters and trappers if they invited us. Of course, we would have to make sure that we had permissions and that it was culturally appropriate. But we may have been able to attend a ceremony or two. We probably would have had many more photos of people doing hunting and trapping. And we would have had more time for review and co-production, where I interpreted this from my perspective based on what I heard, but perhaps one of these gentlemen, if they were here, they would say, well, this is what we really meant by that. So we could have maybe fished that out if we had more time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the second part was
second part. The second part. Well, the one that comes to mind, because it's already it's underway, I think, is sea otters. I think it would be interesting to do it with anything that has the potential to be listed as an endangered species, but things that are close to the clan crests would be important. I would like to do a study like this with killer whale. It would be really interesting to do one on deer, even though they're not necessarily a clan crest. They're extremely important to the people, and you can't pull them apart from the environment. So the forest, the deer, and the wolves are all, and the people need to be studied together. But I think there's some work being done to start a sea otter indigenous knowledge study. That would be a good place to start.
Thank you. We have a question from online. Do you think that the Endangered Species Act should be amended, and what amendments would you propose?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Endangered Species Act, but I think that amending it would be wise. We'd have to really think through it, and get input from the people on the ground who are affected by it. I'm almost positive that ranchers in the western lower 48 would be interested in participating in that conversation too. One thing, possibly if it could be done, would be to extend the timeline between the petition and the species status assessment to a minimum of 2 years, maybe 3, so that there's more time to properly learn and incorporate indigenous knowledge into the process. Another thing would be to, I'm not saying it needs to be amended, but Section 10 is very interesting with the exemptions that it makes for allowing for indigenous hunting and fishing of protected species. It might be worthwhile having indigenous experts look at that and see if those exceptions actually meet their needs. Those are 2 possible amendments that I can think of. Thank you.
Good. I would also like to acknowledge we have students here today from teaching Tlingit culture, language, and literacy classes. So I would like to welcome them and express our appreciation for having them here.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Do you have any questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I would like to end with inviting people to come to our next lecture, either in person or online, to be delivered by Preston Singletary on Eagle's Journey with Raven. That's next Tuesday, September 17th. Thank you very much.